'Twas the night before Christmas, and all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung from the chimney with care, with the hope that St. Nicholas soon would be there. This is what my mom and I said this morning, which is Christmas Eve day, December 2024. We got a lot of presents out there under the tree, and we're excited to celebrate Christmas. But more important, we're going to talk about a moat. I love moats. In the city of Chiang Mai in northern Thailand, there is a wall and water around the city. The water that's around the city is built as a moat to protect the city many, many years ago. So the question is, how does a company build a moat? That's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to first look at what is a moat. Then, how can you measure whether a company has it? And then, what's the company's goal, which is persistent high margins and growth. And then we'll look at some types of moats and the companies that have them. And then I'll show you how I measure moat strength. And my hint for you is WCB. Remember that the Valuation Master Class Show is sponsored by Valuation Master Class Boot Camp. The next boot camp starts on the 16th of February in 2026. Can't believe it's already 2026. If you send me an email that says VMCBC, I'll get you an extra $100 off of the next boot camp. So let's talk about moat. So what is a moat? Well, a moat describes how difficult it is for competitors to copy or undercut a company. A moat is not a financial metric. Financial measures only show the results of a moat. They do not measure the moat itself. So a moat is the protection that you have for your business so that nobody can take away your customers. No one can force you to reduce your prices. It's the dream. How many companies have moats? Very, very few. Do the largest companies have moats? Absolutely. Now, if you want a copy of this presentation, just send me an email and write moat, and I'm going to send you it. It's going to give you a lot of cool stuff, but I just use the global stock tracker to look at companies with their moats. So let's continue. So as an outside analyst, which is what we are if we're a sell-side analyst, we usually can't see product prices, unit cost, or customer behavior in detail. We're just going to rely on the financial statements and other public information that we can find. Now, if you're a company insider, which I'm also a company insider in my coffee business called Coffee Works, and I'm able to see all the detail about the different revenue segments, the number of customers, the average amount that we charge per customer, and all of that stuff. That's an internal amount of data that as an outside analyst, we don't get. Now, some companies will announce it, but most don't. So this is one of the constraints that we face as an outside analyst. Now, gross margin, I would argue, is the cleanest signal available about whether there's a moat. Now, what is it? It's total revenue minus total cost to produce the product divided by revenue. And it reflects that gap between what customers pay and what it costs to deliver the product. And competition is going to attack that gap first. But that gap doesn't reveal whether it is due to being able to charge higher prices like Hermes, or having a lower cost related to the products like Walmart or, let's say, McDonald's. That gross profit margin definitely is not a complete measure, but I would argue it's the best measure. If a company has a strong gross profit margin, it generally means they have a moat. Not always. We have to look at some other factors, because a company could have a high gross profit margin by just driving down all the costs of its production. And in that case, you could argue that it's potentially hurting its quality, the product services costs are going to go up and all that. So let's now go back to this concept a little bit. And ultimately, gross margin must be evaluated over time and relative to peers, right? One strong year means little. And a moat shows up as consistently higher gross margin than competitors over many years. But gross margin alone isn't enough. So first we have to look at gross margin over time, but a company could have high margins but weak customer demand. Yeah, so what? In fact, I had a company that I went to see when I was a young analyst, and I found this company through doing some screening and looking at companies, and I found a company that had a very high return on invested capital, super high, like really high. And I thought, this is fantastic. So I called the company and asked if I could come out and meet them. And I met the CEO, and he took me all around and showed me how efficiently they run the business, but also, he had some strong pricing power in his mind. So I looked at it in detail. The company was growing reasonably okay. And then I recommended it to clients as a sell-side analyst. But what happened? Well, turned out they didn't have any growth in the next 3 years or so. For whatever reason, I can't remember now, it was many years ago, but it could have been the reason that, demand was slowing, or it could have been the reason that their pricing was too high. And that's when I started to realize this competition between profitability and growth. And that's really the origin of how I measure a company's financial performance through my world-class benchmarking scorecard, which we're going to look at the end of this. But it's a combination of profitability and growth. And I always think of that company, it's called SNC in Thailand, that taught me the idea that it's not enough just to have a high gross profit margin. So what else do we need to know? Well, sales growth adds critical confirmation. So sustained sales growth relative to peers shows customers continue to choose the product. So when we combine gross margin and sales growth, it gives the strongest evidence of a moat available to outsiders. And if both remain strong over time versus peers, competitors are likely failing to copy or undercut the business. Now, I explain this in some of my presentations when I explain about the world-class benchmarking scorecard. Is think about the strongest man in the world. At the time when I was looking at it, his name was Eddie Hall. He's huge. So Eddie Hall is this huge guy, and think about the fastest man in the world, growth. Well, at that time, it was Usain Bolt. I haven't looked at it recently, but is the strongest man the fastest? Can't be. And is the fastest man the strongest? Can't be. So these are two opposing forces. You can't have both. Or maybe you can. Think of CrossFit. CrossFit is a combination of strong and fast. It's a measure of who's the strongest, fastest combined. That's what I try to measure when I look at the performance of a company. And that tells me, when I look at that over time and relative to peers, whether a company has a sustainable advantage. So we're going to look at two companies. The last one is going to be my company. So a little bit of reveal there. All right. So let's continue and think about, there are some things that this approach doesn't measure, like capital intensity, cash generation, regulatory risks, niche limits, or management quality. And return on invested capital is not the clearest moat measure. And that's because it mixes product advantage with financing choices, accounting, and management decisions. And a good CFO, they can improve the ROIC without strengthening the moat. They could do it in different ways, particularly the gap between ROIC and weighted average cost of capital. They could just push down the cost of capital, increase the ROIC. Now, if competition requires real ongoing costs to defend the product, those costs eventually show up in financial results. So let's talk about ROIC, because one of my favorite authors is, of course, Michael Porter, who talks about the 5 forces model and all of that. And he generally will use the return on invested capital as the best measure of the competitive advantage of a company. You could say the moat of a company. And if we look at that return on invested capital, If you can sustain a return on invested capital relative to your peers, then you probably have a moat. But remember, return on invested capital measures a lot of different things, including the amount of capital that you have, the amount of cash that you have, the way you're managing inventory and all that. And I would argue that confuses the calculation of what is a moat. A moat really is about the price that you're able to charge or the cost that you're able to do that product, create that product at. And I would just simply focus on that. So let's continue and look at 5 types of moats. Brand power, customers willingly pay more. Switching costs, hard to replace once they're adopted. IP technology, hard to replicate that technology. Think of the software that I'm presenting on right now. Network effects, value grows with more users. Think of Facebook as an example. And cost advantage, structurally lower costs. Think of Walmart as an example. Now, there's many different moats out there in the world, and I'm just trying to describe some general categories. There is no exact definition of what a moat is. I would say that most people are probably overlapping in the way that they describe moats, but this is 5 that I'm looking at right here. So now let's continue and look at this in a little bit more detail. The first one is brand power. Like, customers pay more due to emotional trust and perceived quality built over time. Apple, Hermes, LVMH, L'Oreal, Ferrari, Nike, Coca-Cola, Pepsi. You can see they're in different segments, and they're also, some of them are low cost and some of them are higher cost. Some of them are everyday product like Pepsi or Coke, whereas Ferrari is definitely not an everyday product. Now, I show my estimate here of the average annual cumulative average growth rate over 10 years, if I can get 10 years data. I also show the gross profit margin average over 10 years. Now, some of these are going to be less than 10 years, but generally this gives you an idea. So these are companies that have brand power. What's your favorite brand? Chances are your favorite brand has brand power, and brand power is a moat. Now, the company may have more than one moat, but I'm focusing on what would be the core moat. Let's look at the next one. Switching costs. Salesforce. Look at Salesforce down there. They have an average annual growth rate of 18% over the past 10 years or so, and a gross profit margin of 74. So what does switching costs mean? It means high exit costs from contracts, data loss, retaining keeps customers locked in. The point is Salesforce, you're going to get so deep into managing your Salesforce, using Salesforce, that you can't get out of it. And that's the concept of switching costs. Think about a product right now that you own where the switching cost is high. I remember many years ago, my friend, Stu said to me, oh, Android is much better than iPhone. And I listened to him, and so I bought a Samsung phone. And what I had to do is I had to move everything I had on my Apple device onto the Samsung. And then I had to figure out how to use it and all that. And eventually I gave up and I went back to the iPhone. And that's the switching cost. Here's another good story of that. Many years ago, I used to go back, home to the US quite often when I was younger. And when I first started to be an analyst, the first thing I did when I got a job offer to be an analyst, the first thing I did is I bought software to teach me how to type faster. And so I just practiced typing as fast as I could, so that when I started my first job as an analyst, I wasn't going to be held up by the slowness of my typing. How fast is your typing? Well, I hope your typing is very fast. But many people are like this, and I would argue that you're wasting a lot of time. Now, we may be to a point where you only speak to computers, but I don't think we're there yet. So I did that. But what's interesting is there's a better way of typing called the Dvorak keyboard method, and I thought that this was much more efficient. So when I went home one time, I decided I would start practicing every day that I was on holiday to learn how to use that keyboard, so that I could switch to that keyboard. But the problem is the switching cost was just enormous. First you got to retrain your brain. Okay, I could do that. But then you've got to rethink about your keyboard and so many things until I switched back to the normal keyboard. That's an example of switching costs as an example. Now, remember, if you want this presentation, just send me a message at me@andrewstotz.com and I will send you this PowerPoint. Just type in the email the word moat, MOAT. Let's look at the next one. IP tech, legal patents or deep technical know-how create replicable, barriers that basically can't be copied. Whether that's NVIDIA, ASML, all of these, Novo Nordics, and Eli Lilly are examples of pharmaceuticals in intuitive surgical equipment. And if you've got some sort of protections, then you've got potential moat. And we can see the average 10-year sales growth is huge for most of these companies. Qualcomm is a little bit lower at 7%, but come on, the company's been in existence for so long and it's getting a 55% gross margin. Let's look at the next one, the next moat category. That's network effects. Alphabet, Meta, Visa, MasterCard. These are interesting because basically products become more valuable as the user base grows. And think about when you first found Meta or Facebook. When you first found Facebook, you basically started using it and you started connecting to other people. And all of a sudden, Facebook grew because of you. Now, another one is Dropbox. We used Dropbox and we also used Slack. Those two basically had a network effect that you could recommend somebody or share a file using Dropbox. And all of a sudden, the other one, other people started saying, wow, what's that? I want to use it. So network effects are one big way of getting a moat. Let's continue and look at cost advantage. This is structural scale or efficient processes allow sustainably lower prices than competitor. Amazon is the king of this. Texas Instruments, Lind, Air Products, these companies, which the last two are gas companies, in kind of industrial gas mainly, and they basically have cost advantages. Now, one company that has an interesting cost advantage that I don't show here is McDonald's, in the sense that they have a footprint already all across the world. And one of the things about McDonald's is that their model is a little bit different from the others. And that is, with McDonald's, they own the land in a lot of cases. So their strength is also related to their network of land ownership, because that land is something that they can continue to generate. They're not going to be pushed out. Let's look at another one. Oh, yeah, here. Okay, so these moats, that's the 5 moats. These existing moats take decades and they don't come cheap. Let's look at a couple of these companies. Alphabet's return on assets, a net margin is 32%, incredible, when the average across the world is about 6%. And ROA is about 27%. The average ROA across the world is about 5%. But you're going to have to pay a PE of 29 and a price to book of 9. Meta is almost identical. What about LVMH, Hermes, Nike? All of these companies are trading at massive PEs. Amazon, massive PE. Coke, Pepsi, Nestle, as another example. These are earning very high. Now, keep in mind that this table shows net profit margin and ROA and PE, price to book, at present. So the data I showed you before was over my best estimate of a 10-year period. Some companies didn't have it, so I just used less than 10. But this is over, this current period. I got this data from the Global Stock Tracker. Let's look at some other companies like healthcare. Healthcare, Intuitive Surgical gets a 29% net profit margin and a 15% net profit margin. Compare that to the industry average, it's double the industry average. And therefore, you're paying a massive 72 times PE. Would I want to pay 72 times PE? I probably wouldn't pay that, right? And on an FVMR ranking, even though profitability is high, the valuation is so high that the FVMR ranking goes down. Eli Lilly, Thermo Fisher, Novo Nordisk, all of them are generally getting pretty high returns, Thermo Fisher's got a lower ROA because it's a lot more capital intensive. And only Novo Nordisk now is trading at a very low PE of about 11 times. NVIDIA, Broadcom, all of these, incredible. Qualcomm now is pretty lower on the net margin basis, but what we can see is that it's still relatively expensive. And finally, the final group of moats is companies like Microsoft, Salesforce, Intuit, ServiceNow, Adobe, Apple, Lynn as an example. These are all very, very expensive companies. Now, when you see something like you see Apple here with a 36% PE, but a 54% or 54 times, 36 times PE and a 54 times price to book, that just tells you that the company's been buying back shares, and they're buying back shares at a pretty high price. And the result of that is that the equity value is falling, and therefore the price to book is rising. So how do I measure moats? I use my world-class benchmarking scorecard. And on the top is what's called profitable growth. That's a combination of profitability, which is below it on the left, and growth, which is below it on the right. I compare these two and I combine them to get to my profitable growth score. The key thing here is that, in fact, what we're looking at is expense control, which is related to gross margin, and revenue growth. So the two ones in the middle at the bottom are the ones that tell me more about what's going on. And this was my business when we came out of the crisis, the 2000 COVID crisis. It still was very difficult. We've been improving our profitability from 10 to 9 to 5 to 3 to 4. Our objective is to get to 1. We had some additional provisions this year, which is fine, but ultimately we're going to be in a strong position in 2026. And I think we will be able to have absolutely world-class financial performance. So this gives you a picture of this concept of moats. I love that concept. So DPC, yep, that's very surprising for many that McDonald's real estate moat is quite strong. Yeah, the fact that they own the real estate is critical. That is what I'm talking about today. Remember that the Valuation Master Class Show is sponsored by the Valuation Master Class Bootcamp. Just send me a message, VMCBC, to get an additional $100 off. Meanwhile, I want to wish you a happy year-end, a happy holiday season. Tomorrow is Christmas Day, so for me, I won't be presenting, but I will be back on Friday and next week and enjoying the rest of the week. Have a great day, and I'll see you here in the boot camp or in my inbox.